Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock on Tuesday, and this is Planet Poet Words in Space, and I'm your host, Sharon Israel. So glad you're listening on this really beautiful spring day up here in Roxbury. Today, calling in from Manhattan is poet, editor, translator, lawyer, and champion of the environment, Elizabeth J. Coleman. We'll be discussing her wildly relevant and beautiful new anthology, Here, Poems for the Planet, to be released by Copper Canyon Press next week. Here, edited by Elizabeth Coleman, features a foreword from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Coleman's superb international selections of 128 living poets, including U.S. poet laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, and youth poets, and a guide to activism from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, Sharon.
Oh, it's so great you're here today. Thank you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Wonderful. I'm going to let everybody know a little bit about you and read your bio that's in the book, Here, Poems for the Planet. Elizabeth J. Coleman is a published poet, public interest attorney, environmental activist, and teacher of mindfulness. She is the author of 2 poetry collections, The Fifth Generation, Spite and Dival Press, 2016, and Proof, Spite and Dival Press, 2014, which was a finalist for the University of Wisconsin Press's Brittingham and Pollock Prizes, and 2 chapbooks. She translated into French Pythagoras in Love, Pythagore Amoureux, I think that's it, Folded World Press, 2015, which is a bilingual sonnet collection. Her poems have been published in a number of journals and anthologies, and she is a vice president of the Poetry Society of America, a member of the New York, Georgia, and D.C. bars. Elizabeth runs Mindful Solutions, LLC, and is president of the Beatrice R. and Joseph A. Coleman Foundation. And here, Elizabeth has brought together her love for poetry, for justice, and for our planet. This is unique, I think, to have an anthology of this kind. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think that it's the combined. First of all the poems were by poets who were living when their poems were selected, which I think is very unusual. And I wanted it to be international and to set a very definite story, which I think we'll get into. And I think it's unique to have a guide to activism at the end.
Yes.
Because it, as we'll talk about, it inspires action and then helps people figure out how to take action to protect our beautiful world.
Right. So it's not just reading the poems, and when people read them, they'll be moved to action, and the guide gives them a way to move forward.
Exactly. So I think, I'm not sure that's ever been done, anything like that. Correct.
And it's a very interesting, in addition to the guide, which is at the end of the book, you've created 5 sections of poetry. I just was very moved by your preface to the book. You quoted from 3 very famous writers, Shelley, Pasternak, and Audre Lorde. I'll just read this, which you said about Percy Bysshe Shelley, calling poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Boris Pasternak said, a poem, which I love, is a burning, smoking piece of conscience that can spark political action. Or as Audre Lorde put it, in poetry is not a luxury. Poetry is a vital necessity of our existence. If you just comment briefly on how you chose those quotes for the book, Elizabeth.
Well, I think that I was very interested in the connection between poetry and action, and for me, poetry has been a giant inspiration in difficult moments in my life and has always really inspired me, and I feel like this is a moment that calls not just for mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, for what we're doing to our planet and its creatures, and particularly vulnerable inhabitants, but also for hope for actions people are taking. And I chose those quotes to connect poetry to hope, to putting aside cynicism, despair that leads to cynicism, and therefore feeling the energy to take action.
And
they all come from that impulse.
that's what I felt from the preface, that despite the the dire circumstances we find ourselves in, there you do give not false hope and overenthusiastic hope for an easy solution, but that if we work, we can mitigate some of the things that are going on.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's well put, and I think we should never give up hope. And we should also, and there is reason to hope. And we need to, as you say, realistic reason to hope, not sort of silly reason to hope, but real reason to hope. But it requires action, and as we all are beginning to learn, it requires action fast, but can be done.
Yes. You put here is your creation as an editor. We don't get to talk to the point of what the editor's job is and how an editor creates a volume or an anthology. You've been on the show talking about your own work and before on Planet Poet, but never as an editor. And could you talk a little bit about the role of the editor and how you put the 5 sections together?
Yeah, so I carefully structured the sections. The sections are, as you said, there are 5 sections. And what I tried to do was create kind of an arc or an upside down or parabola or whatever. The first section is called Where You'd Want to Come From, Poems for Our Planet, and it's about the beauty of our planet. The second section is called The Gentle Light That Vanishes, Our Endangered World, and this is where the poems of real despair and mourning are. And then the third section is As If They'd Never Been, Poems for the Animals, where I have chosen poems of extinction and about animals. And then, so we sort of start in a point of high praise for the earth, then sort of go to this sort of where the real despair is, I think, in terms of what we're doing to our planet, what we've done to it, and the creatures who inhabit it with us. And then what I try to do is come back up. And the fourth section is poems by young people called The Ocean Within Them, Voices of Young People. And it's all poets under age 18. 2 of them are 6, or were 6 when they wrote their poems. And then the last section is Like You Are New to the World, From Inspiration to Action. So those poems, I think, are meant to be very energizing and inspiring. And so it creates a realistic narrative in a sense, but one that takes you on a journey, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So I constructed the sections very carefully, and then within the sections I tried to have it flow very carefully from poem to poem and then section to section.
And from poems from the last part of each section into the next section.
Yes.
That's the arc you're talking about, too.
Yes, and that was a lot of fun, actually.
We have to talk about the introduction by the Dalai Lama that he wrote. And could you
moving.
Could you discuss the genesis and the content of the foreword by the Dalai Lama?
Yes. So I wanted to have someone write the foreword who sort of reflected the vision, because it felt like a big vision.
Right.
And I was trying really hard and talking with the editor about who could best reflect that vision. And His Holiness has written a great deal about the environment, and I've read a lot of his work in part because I teach mindfulness, which is quite connected to the Dalai Lama. And I realized, as I was sort of trying to think it through, I realized I was trying to think of this. There are 3 degrees of separation between me and His Holiness. So I sent a proposal to the person I know, who was very excited about it, and he sent that proposal to the person he knew, who was one step more connected, who sent it to the person he knew, who works with His Holiness. And so that's how, and then he was, enthusiastic about it, because this reflects his vision. I mean, his vision is so big, I don't want to say that, but a piece of his vision.
Right.
And he, We sent him some, in the proposal were some of the poems. I think he was excited about the poems. He comments on the poems in his preface, in his foreword, I'm sorry. His is the foreword.
Right.
And it's a very moving foreword because also he's talking about how we're all together on this beautiful blue planet.
His foreword also brings together the spirituality and the call for action that you're striving for in the anthology.
Yes, that's a very good point. And it's also a very optimistic foreword.
Yes.
One thing I love about what he says is, he says, we see the photographs of Earth and space. We see no boundaries between us, right? And that's true, just this one blue planet, a natural world that supports us all. But then he says, we have to see humanity as one family and the natural world as our home. And I just love what he says. He says it's not necessarily somewhere sacred or holy, but simply where we live. So it's in our interest to look after it.
Very practical.
Yeah, it's just practical and beautiful and unpretentious.
Thank you. Would you read a couple of poems from section 1? It's titled again, Where You'd Want to Come From. All the poems glorify the beauty of our world in their own ways.
Yes, I would love to read 2 poems. And the poems I would like to read, I'm going to read first a poem by an Israeli. As we talked about, I think these are from all over the world. The poems are from all over the world, yeah. So the first poem I'd like to read is by Mordecai Geldman, who is from Israel, and his poem is called Almost Flowers. I almost brought flowers, you said, and I thanked you with humility and joy for almost flowers, would-be flowers blossoming in our fancy, in the lusting flower bed of my soul and yours, flowers from a field, not a shop, budding tiny and quivering in the spring's breeze, white blossoms with dewy leaves awaking in our hearts a new virginity, an innocent touch, stunned and drugged in the miracle of our hunger. Also blossoms of angels' trumpets will soar in the skies of our love, and peach blossoms, translucently pink, will drop through the night upon our bed, and with them almond blossoms, vertiginous, joyful, reclusive, and paper blossoms, where we signed our names again and again, will adorn our common grave, visible already through the mist of our future, in a plot strewn with violets.
That's a gorgeous poem. It's Elizabeth J. Coleman reading from her anthology here, Poems for the Planet, Mordecai Geldman's Almost Flowers. It's a perfect poem to open with and to salute the spring, which is with us today.
Yes, and show the connection between the generative power of the earth for us as humans, how much the beauty in our lives comes from nature. I almost brought flowers. It's just it's clever, but it's also very, very poignant because it's, not plucking the flowers. You're thinking about doing that, but you're not doing that. That's a great point. And I thank you with humility and joy for almost flowers. So it's also about, in a way, it's a kind of ars poetica, isn't it? Because they're flowers of the imagination.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
And the next one?
Yes, so the next one is by an Iranian poet living in exile in the UK, and it's translated from Parsi. And it's called, the poet is Esmail Koy, and the poem is Image of Kindness. Learn from this tree. It offers its bountiful canopy of shade over your head. Rain or shine. Rain or shine no matter whence you came to it. And it never, not even out of innocent curiosity, sizes you up. Hey, stranger, where are you from?
That's lovely. Very nicely read, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you.
That's Image of Kindness by Ismail Koy.
I think so, yeah.
I don't know anything about the original language, but it seems like it's a really good translation.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah. And it also reminds me of the other poem in that it's a poem of generosity, of great generosity, and the generosity of nature.
Yes, but it also it still seems that the tree goes beyond whatever humans are sitting under it. You know, it has its own majesty, and it sort of deigns to be kind in a way by the mystery of trees. But it's also about immigration, I think. It's just very interesting.
Yes, so it's always sort of that interaction between nature and humans and the complexity,
yeah. This is Planet Poet, Words in Space, an edition of The Writer's Voice here at WIOX. I'm Sharon Israel, your host, with my guest, poet and editor of the anthology Here, Elizabeth J. Coleman. Elizabeth, let's move on to Section 2, the gentle light that vanishes, our endangered world. And these titles are quite beautiful. These are your titles, of course.
The titles, I took them from snippets of poems in the section.
Very nice. So
and then sort of said what they were. Yeah, that actually was, I worked very hard on that piece of it, trying to get the titles to be just right. So this is one of the two very sad sections of the book. So I tried to inject a little bit of lightness into these sections from time to time, but this is where the real grief for our planet is.
You'll be reading a poem by Patricia Young?
Yes, and it's called Ruin and Beauty. It's so quiet now the children have decided to stop being born. We raise our cups in an empty room. In this light, the curtains are transparent as gauze. Through the open window, we hear nothing. No airplane, lawnmower, no siren speeding its white pain through the city's traffic. There is no traffic. What remains is all that remains. The brick school at the 5 Points crosswalk is drenched in the morning glory. Its white flowers are trumpets festooning this coastal town. Will the eventual forest rise up and remember our footsteps? Already seedlings erupt through cement. Crabgrass heaves through cracked marble. Already wolves come down from the hills to forage among us. We are like them now, just another species looking to the stars and howling extinction. They say the body accepts any kind of sorrow, that our ancestors lay down on their stomachs in school hallways. As children, they lay down like matches, waiting for a nuclear fire. It wasn't supposed to end like this. All ruin and beauty, vines, water falling down, a century's architecture. It wasn't supposed to end so quietly, without fanfare or fuss. A man and woman collecting rain in old coffee tins. Darling, the wars have been forgotten. These days our quarrels are only with ourselves. Tonight you sit on the edge of the bed loosening your shoes. The act is soundless, without future weight. Should we name this failure? Should we wake to the regret at the end of time, doing what people have always done, and say it was not enough?
That's A Ruin and Beauty by Patricia Young, read by Elizabeth J. Coleman. That's quite a poem. The first line, it's so quiet now, the children have decided to stop being born.
Yeah.
And there is no traffic. And that's what happens. I mean, things just stop. If humans vanished, nature would retake, for example, New York City in 3 days. The subways would stop. The water would burst through the pipes, and the subway would be flooded. But it's a beautiful elegy for us.
And it's so interesting because it's in the present tense. So it's sort of a dystopian, from a human point of view, a dystopian picture. And she puts it in the present, and she says our ancestors got under the desks, and our ancestors would be us.
Right.
You know, so she situates it a couple generations from now. I find it very bracing, and I think it's a warning.
I'm also struck by the title and where the titular line is situated in the poem towards the end. All ruins. There's such a thing as a ruins porn that exists, glorifying ruins in Europe and Poland, wherever they are, or modern ruins, which are almost decaying as soon as they're erected, and the beauty of ruins. beauty of it all, because I find that sort of self-referential in the poem because the poem is so beautiful.
That's interesting. And also that the beauty, it's the same beauty of nature that's in the Mordecai Gelman poem. But now
it's our ruin and the beauty that remains.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
And how did you find these poems, Elizabeth?
I found them a number of ways. I spent a lot of time at Poets House in New York City and combed through journals that might have had environmental poems. I looked through anthologies and got names of poets I'd never heard of. It was very important to me to have poems from different countries and different socioeconomic groups, different ethnicities. So I was very mindful of that as I went through it, and I just was on it. It was like a glorious treasure hunt. People would say the name of someone who I might not have heard of, who wrote poems about eco poetry or poems about nature, who were living now, and one thing would lead to another thing, would lead to another thing. The first poem in the book I found, I just was glancing up. I was at Poets House, and I looked up at a shelf, and there was a book on the spine. It said, "The Planet," and I pulled it down, and that's the first poem in the book. I'd never heard of the poet.
That's wonderful.
So there was a lot of serendipity. The fun was to be just completely open to the serendipity.
I was just going to say that you were open to whatever was going to happen, and you might not have noticed that book there if you weren't really open to finding things like that.
It was incredibly joyful to look. And when I would stumble on a poem that felt right, I just would feel this kind of stirring. It was really interesting. I read poems by people who I thought I would hope to have in the book, and it wasn't, if I didn't get that stirring, they might not be in the book.
That's wonderful. The joy of creating and shaping and creating a volume like this, the subject matter is so serious, but the joy is still there in the creation of it, in the shaping of what you did.
That's interesting. There's a wonderful line from William Matthews that even in the most sad poem form is still play. And so even choosing a very sad poem, it's still creating the book is still play in some way. Yeah.
You quote Zagayevsky's Mutilated World, the poet Zagayevsky, and the peril of the earth and its creatures. And you talk about that in discussion of section 2. And I had to mention his name so I could pronounce it correctly on the air.
You did great. But also that poem, I love the name of his poem, Try to Praise the Mutilated World.
Yes.
And that's part of what section does. It tries to praise the mutilated world.
It's an incredible line.
Yeah.
You have another poem for us. Thanks by W.S. Merwin.
Yes, I'm going to read the last stanza of Thanks, which is another example of praising the mutilated world, where he tries to thank the mutilated world. As people know, we lost this absolutely, if not the greatest poet of our time, one of the couple of greatest poets of our time, W.S. Merwin, very recently. And so after this poet anthology had gone to press. W.S. Merwin, Thanks, and this is the last stanza. With the animals dying around us, taking our feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you. Faster and faster, with nobody listening, we are saying thank you, thank you. We are saying and waving, dark though it is.
Thanks by W.S. Merwin. You're choosing that last stanza though, to thank in the middle of what's going on, and who are we thanking?
Yeah.
These two poems, the Ruin and Beauty and Thanks, represent section 2. I know section 3 is also about the the troubles, the environmental troubles that we have caused, and how it's affecting the world, and possibly causing the world's destruction on several levels. But how do they represent Section 2 for you? That thank you and then ruin and beauty.
No. I mean, I just think that, first of all, the Ruin and Beauty is just a poem of, as I said, utter despair, I think, as humans, and as sentient beings on the planet. Because she didn't mention any animals living either, just the plant life, any other sentient beings. And so it's a poem. It's sort of where I didn't want to stop in this book, but that is sort of perhaps the saddest poem, I think, in the book. There's a kind of, in Merwin's poem, the thank you has a kind of, not joy, but just the idea of gratitude. That we're saying thank you anyway. It's interesting because the cadence of Ruin and Beauty is so slow and mournful, and the cadence of the thanks of Merwin's poem is almost feverish.
It's
like,
true.
We're saying thank you and thank you faster and faster, dark though it is. And, you know, W.S. Merwin was Buddhist, and I think it's very much that kind of perspective in his poem. And that there's that saying that the only prayer, is it Thomas Merton? Someone said the only prayer you need is thank you. So I think it's a prayer. It's a poem of prayer in a way. And I think that's one of the things I really came to understand even better is, you know, I think as I worked on this, how much poem is secular prayer. We haven't talked about that much.
That a poem is a secular prayer.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. It's a prayer for, it's a kind of has a cadence of prayer and has a prayer quality. And I felt that in these poems.
Yeah, it reminds me, too, of, so I've heard that certain mystic rabbis in the concentration camps would dance in the face of what was happening. I think it's that same kind of thing. Yes,
and I think that, but again, that is not what I hope people will take away from. I want people to take away possibility too. Right,
and you do that as you emerge from the section, you go into a lighter, slightly lighter mood in Section 3. And if you would read something from, you said 1,000 Saxophones by Lee Herrick, which sort of provides a lovely segue.
Yeah, I love this poem. And I'm just going to read the last 3 lines. This is Lee Herrick, a young poet, and it's called 1,000 Saxophones, and the epigraph is after Hurricane Katrina, a poem for the living and the dead. So I'm skipping over the first page for time's sake, and I think this is how this Section 2 ends, and this is how I feel, actually. Herrick writes, okay? He writes, "But I feel like the saints are marching. They are singing a slow, deep, and beautiful song, waiting for us to join in."
Could you say that again?
This is from 1,000 Saxophones, so it's about music. "But I feel like the saints are marching. They are singing a slow, deep, and beautiful song, waiting for us to join in."
That it's so catalytic. It's that merging of hope and action, sort of hinting at that coming through.
Yes, and it's after Katrina, a poem for the living and the dead, and I think that's how I feel. The saints are marching, and they're waiting for us to join in, and this is an attempt to join in this book.
And to merge, perhaps, with the world in a more meaningful way, if I can say that. And you're listening to Planet Poet, Words in Space. I'm Sharon Israel, your host. Here by phone from Manhattan is poet and editor Elizabeth J. Coleman, talking about her new anthology, Here, Poems for the Planet, published by Copper Canyon Press. And Elizabeth, let's continue with Section 3, shall we?
Sure. So Section 3 is As If They'd Never Been, Poems for the Animals, and this is where the poems speak of extinction and also the creatures with whom we share our beautiful planet. So the first poem I'm going to read is more of the kind of devastating variety, like Ruin and Beauty. I think it begins the section, and I think it's just a gorgeous poem by a poet named Annie Boutel. And it's really talking about the bee collapse. So, the rapture of bees. Suddenly absent, vamoosed, as if they'd never been, never spiraled in air, nor clung to each other through frozen dark, nor filled the hive with their million life bodies, packed shelves of wax and gold, and all that honeyed buzz. Like a child in a bed in Portugal, just not there. Only space in her stead. Or hair in coils on the barber's floor, the neck abandoned in chill. Or the breast with the other discarded body parts, somewhere in a hospital basement, and only the stitches to show where it was. How not to envy the bees? So fierce and uprush it can't be resisted. That soaring in air to meet whoever is coming. The cell phone tower bristling with urgent messages about the time, the place, and the fake plastic branches or arms that sweep them in, not one left. And death is simple, just being where the others are, a trembling vibration.
Oh, that's pretty devastating.
It's so
oh,
devastating.
My goodness. That honeyed buzz, it's, the language is so beautiful. With the neck abandoned and chill, but could you explain how not envy the bees? Is that because, I mean, that's quite a statement in there. It's
how not to envy the bees?
Right. I mean, she says how not to envy the bees, as if we're left with a slower demise.
Yeah. And the sort of rapture. It's a rapture.
Oh, the rapture of the bees, of course.
Yeah. So they're having, yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that the analogy to the child missing from her bed in Portugal.
Right. Oh my goodness.
It's so devastating. And to the breast. I mean, it's such brilliant imagery. It's sort of also, you'd expect the metaphors to go in the opposite direction.
Could you explain?
Well, just the going from the bee rapture to these two very kind of personal, people devastating images of lust that we can all recognize culturally. You know, I would expect almost the analogy to go in the other direction, or the analogies to go in the other direction.
I like how the bees are vamoosed.
I love that. Isn't that great?
Yeah, it's a great use of the word. Also, they have no part of desire in it, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's also so colloquial. I mean, it's so sort of culturally not, it's so unpretentious.
Yes.
Yeah,
And so
it's a beautiful poem.
Yeah, you read it beautifully. The Rapture of the Bees by Annie Boutel. This is in the anthology of Here, Poems for the Planet. You know, in reading an anthology, you really need to concentrate on each poem. It's hard to do that all at once, right? You sort of open and close and open and absorb each poem, and that takes a little time.
Yes. Well, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, Sharon, because one of the things about this book that I tried to do very definitely was to have the poems all be accessible. We haven't really talked about that, but in terms of designing this and being the editor, I wanted every poem to be accessible to every reader. I didn't want this to be a book just for poets.
Right.
I wanted young people to be able to read it. I wanted people who haven't turned to poetry in the past to be able to read it and to relate to it. So yes, I think you have to absorb them, and with all poetry, you can absorb it on a lot of levels. But I felt like all these poems, they don't feel esoteric.
No. It helps too to read poetry out loud. It becomes has a very full impact that way too. But they work well on the page and when you say them.
Yes, and as you know, poetry is music, so
right.
Yeah, so it's nice. I think it's meant to be read out loud, really. But also, I tried to design the book. I mean, I read it through a million times, and I tried to design it so it could be read. You just sit down and read it. You know, that it was that kind of thing. And then things lead into things in ways that felt right.
With the flow of the book, you need to read it. But it also,
And I think, one word might be the same as the word in the prior poem, even if they're very different poems.
And you also want to reach a larger audience. Could you tell us about having Congress access to the book?
Yeah, so the press, Copper Canyon Press, which is the publisher of Here, did a Kickstarter campaign and raised money, and they're going to give a copy of Here to every member of Congress.
That's amazing.
Isn't that exciting?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
And the proceeds of the book are going to...
Well, my royalties.
Uh-huh.
Copper Canyon is a nonprofit press, but I'm donating my royalties to the Union of Concerned Scientists, which wrote the Activist Guide.
That's great.
Yeah, because I wanted it to really be, a completely a circle that made sense in what I was trying to accomplish.
Elizabeth, would you read another poem from Section 3 for us?
I would love to. And I'm going to read one by another of our great poets we just lost, Mary Oliver.
Right.
And it's interesting. This is a poem, in a sense, about a different kind of rapture, but a much more, it's about life and death, but it's not devastating in the way the last one was, I don't think. Mary Oliver, The Fish. The first fish I ever caught would not lie down quiet in the pail, but flailed and sucked at the burning amazement of the air and died in the slow pouring off of rainbows. Later, I opened his body and separated the flesh from the bones and ate him. Now the sea is in me. I am the fish glitters in me. We are risen, tangled together, certain to fall back to the sea. Out of pain and more pain, we feed this feverish plot. We are nourished by the mystery.
That's Elizabeth Coleman reading The Fish by Mary Oliver. It starts, it's funny when it starts. The first fish I ever caught would not lie down quiet in the pail, in a macabre way.
Yes.
But it's very plain language, but it's it cuts through, so to speak.
Yeah. And I love this. Out of pain and more pain, we feed this feverish plot. We are nourished by the mystery.
And the sea is in us, and the fish is in us. That's the melding going on.
Yeah, beautiful.
In the book, too. Yeah, it's great. Section 4, The Ocean Within Them, Voices of Young People. And I'm quoting just of what you say about Section 4 in the preface, that it begins to circle back towards the possibility of hope with poems by children and teens. I love this section. All of them were mesmerizing, but this had a particular joy to it, especially with the poets that you chose. Would you comment a little bit on how you found these poems and what you'd like to read today?
Yes, and these were a little harder to find. I found them both through Scholastic has a poetry contest for high school students. So several of these poems were winners or runners-up. There's also a Robert Creeley Foundation has a contest, and a couple of the poems I found through the foundation, which was both Scholastic and the foundation were very generous in helping me get the materials I needed. And then other poems, I went at Poets House. They have this wonderful section of these sort of little private books of poems by young people that, you could never find them online. You had to go through these books and books of poems. There's one poem that appears that was some collection that Franklin and Marshall put together in Erie, I think, and I found a poem in there. And, there was one of the poems, a poem by a boy who was 6 when he wrote it. I found it in the poems that were at the Botanical Garden for the Chihuly exhibit.
Oh.
So there were lots of different sources, but they weren't as obvious as some of,
So more of a treasure hunt then.
Even more of a treasure hunt. It was all a huge treasure hunt, but this was even more of a treasure hunt.
Would you read two? I think we're doing two from this section.
Sure. I was going to read Dolbear's Law by Noah Aryeh that opens it. Were you going to explain the
Sure.
Dolbear's Law?
I looked up Dolbear's Law, and it's Dolbear's Law is about the relationship between air temperature and the rate at which crickets chirp. And it's from Amos Dolbear's 1897 article, The Cricket as a Thermometer. I thought that was amazing.
That's perfect. So this is by Noah Aryeh, Dolbear's Law. To love as a cricket does, to occupy an ear, a blade of grass, to see with eyes like cut stones, to behold the miraculous pebbles sitting unprecious, 100-fold, 1,000,000-fold, to sing for dirt, to bring cut-up wings together in hymn and count time as the sky goes cold, tempo for temperature, louder even than the cone-headed katydids, to listen closely with the crook of a knee for a harmony of veins, to sing to be heard by everything, earth and air and sky and you, muscles thrumming with the atmosphere, symphony for the soil.
Symphony for the soil. That's wonderful.
It is such a lovely poem.
Oh, my God. The sky goes cold. It's a wonderful poem.
Yeah, and you're so great to point out that title and what it means.
Well, I was fascinated because I had no idea what it meant. But it really adds to the poem to know about it. But you don't really need to know about it, but it sort of deepens the experience of the poem. Is that a translation, or is that
No, this is written in English.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah,
and
it is lovely. Thank you. And then, should I read the next one?
Sure.
Okay, so this is called In the Summer by Kyra Pelowitz. In the summer, I write ripe poems. I write honey and sun poems. I write fermenting poems. I write mushroom poems. I write sweet scent dirt poems. Nothing is ripe here during the summer, but I don't write char poems. I don't write dust poems. I don't write poems slick with sweat. I write wind and sandstone poems instead. I write poems where the wind makes the mountains a flute. I write rib cage and hip bone poems. I write poems that crumple below the weight of swollen stone fruits. I don't write poems that wake up damp. I don't write parched poems or poems that shrivel around the edges. I don't write sunburnt poems. I write heartbeat and blood poems that disguise as love poems instead. I write rain poems disguised as love poems and love poems that pull on the collarbones of rain poems. And I write lying poems instead. I don't write moist palm, nervous poems or poems that have to catch their breath, but I do write moon poems and oyster poems instead. I write sulfur geyser poems. I write deep-sea translucent poems. I write nighttime poems, and I write moon poems instead because I cannot reach the moon. I write lying poems filled with rain. I write poems full of the sumptuous night and poems that ripple when touched. I write moon poems that hide in oyster poems and palm poems full of oysters. I write poems where I drink the moon, slick and soft and cool.
What rhythm in that poem.
Isn't it lovely?
Incredible.
Yeah, it's just, it begs to be read fast, doesn't it?
Yes. It's so clever and funny. It's
and joyful.
It's got everything, very joyful. And I was reading that, I think she's a student at the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology.
Yes, isn't that so
That's
cool?
amazing. I was struck by that. I really was. Let's continue with Section 5, Like You Are New to the World, From Inspiration to Action. And I'm just going to quote you saying about what you're saying about Section 5. In this anthology, poets are listening, seeing, feeling, mourning, hoping, and acting. And I like the new synthesis going on. The fifth section contains, this is you again, the fifth section contains poems that are bracing, energizing, and inspiring. You want to say anything more about the section before you read your poem?
No, well, maybe yes. Just that it's meant to leave people just dying to go to the next section, which is the Guide to Activism, to build some sort of joy and momentum, build on what the children, the young people have written, and then it kind of inspire with a range of voices in this last section.
Right. Well, I'm anxious for you to read your poem, your own poem, on a Saturday in the Anthropocene. And if you could explain what the Anthropocene era is, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
You are. Anthropocene, it's the current geological age, and it's viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. So it's this age when human activity is the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And actually there are two poems, one in the second section and one in this section, that have Anthropocene in the title.
Mm-hmm. A horrible honorific to have this age named after humans.
Absolutely.
It's stunning.
Yeah. But it's true.
Yep. Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Hang on. It's called On a Saturday in the Anthropocene. On a Saturday in the Anthropocene, as I walk in the light of a two-rivered island to my post office, I mourn the last typewriter repair shop in New York going out of business. Mourn that this moves us further from letters, from connection, from writing home. I mourn that it's so warm monk parrots nest in Sheepshead Bay, lovely as that sight is. Mourn what we've done to birds. For 150 million years, they saw their reflections only in the sea. Then I notice a fire escape on a 2-century-old building casting a soft shadow. I see wheels on a bicycle that, like meditation, seem to slow time. I remember gorillas stay up all night to groom their dead, and reading about a woman in Ohio who gave every building in town a new coat of paint after she was laid off. At my post office, endangered too, I avoid the self-service kiosks, wait in line for a human. A clerk waves me over with her smile, asks where I've been. She tells me about a cruise she's taken with her mother, describes the buffets, the turquoise of the ship's pool. Now I'm smiling too. What's your name? I've been meaning to ask for ages. Grace, she says. I thought you knew.
That's on a Saturday in the Anthropocene by Elizabeth J. Coleman, reading her own poem from her anthology that she edited here, Poems for the Planet. It's such a poignant poem, and the fact that her name was Grace, which gives grace. I mean, the whole poem is about grace in a way. I love the walk through the city and the listening to her story and then going back to what you remember, and it's very expansive in time and place.
Thank you.
It's very also matter of fact. The typewriter, the loss of the typewriter, that's just the beginning. Anything else you'd like to add?
It's just that I did feel this grace. Those were the things I was thinking of, was just how all these losses and loss and loss and loss and our natural losses and what we've done to birds, and then sort of these sort of positive realizations, and just the gorillas, they're endangered. That's why I say that my post office was endangered too. And just this, and then meeting this woman who embodied her name. It was just beautiful. I've actually given her a copy of the book.
Oh, wonderful.
Grace at the post office. She's excited about
great.
it.
The time is fleeting. I can't believe this. I don't know if we have another time for the Gary Snyder poem, but we could. But I want you to at least a couple of minutes talking about the guide.
Yes.
So what would you like to do?
I'm just going to, how much time do we have?
We have about 4 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to read you the last part of the Gary Snyder poem for the children.
Okay.
In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together, learn the flowers, go light. So, which I think goes well into the Activist Guide.
Yes, yes.
And the Activist Guide is, the Union of Concerned Scientists has just written a wonderful activist guide. It's very focused on what we as individuals can do vis-a-vis those people, those institutions that can make just enormous differences. and it's wonderfully practical. There's the first section is reaching out to your representatives. The second section is corporate activism. The third section is connecting with the media. And the fourth section is finding your power in numbers. It's very readable. It tells you step by step how to write a letter to your legislator, how to meet with your legislator, how to attend legislative meetings, how to write a letter to the editor, how to do all these things. And it's just takes you through it step by step. So if we're all a little intimidated by those things, and it just sort of walks you through it. And the idea is to find joy in that action.
Yeah, I read it, and it sort of alleviated my anxiety. I was afraid it would add to my anxiety, but it doesn't. It sort of eases you into what you can do in very small increments of activity.
Yep.
And that really was, to me, very successful.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a thrilling, and it's not that long. The sections of it aren't long. They give, Union of Concerned Scientists have given great examples.
Yes, it's very simple language. It's comprehensive in its way.
Yes, and it really, I feel like it's sort of inspiring of what we can do. Even something so simple as, now we've got the plastic bag ban in New York State, but just sort of posting something from someone about the plastic bag ban and getting people to join in that action, even on Facebook. Just simple things. Instead of feeling kind of shame of what we have for what we haven't done, feeling joy in what we have, and that gives us hope and courage.
That's a very good way of putting it. And if you want to get more information about the book?
I have a page on my website, ElizabethJColeman.com, or people can go to the Copper Canyon Press website, and it's for sale on Amazon as well. Can I just read one quote from the Activist Guide?
Please.
Okay, so at the very end of the Activist Guide, we say, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote in his foreword, if we have the capacity to destroy the earth, so too we have the capacity to protect it. The world is worth dreaming and working for. We're here, and we must move forward together.
Elizabeth J. Coleman, thank you so much for being on the show today and sharing this remarkable book and what's in it and the guide and the poems. I wish you great luck with it, and I hope everybody can read it and enjoy it as I have, and I'm sure our listeners, too, have enjoyed your beautiful readings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It was such a pleasure.